Okay. Boker Tov. Good morning on this wonderful, great Sunday morning here in southern Florida, where actually the weather is just fantastic. You know, it's nice to have a cooling out once in a while here in South Florida. It's just so fresh. You wake up, amachaya. It's great. It's wonderful. And it has the added benefit that a cup of coffee, God's great gift to humanity, is even more appreciated and enjoyed. So let's make a bracha, let's make a blessing together, which we'll do in a moment. I'd like to get a few more people on so that they could answer Amen. Today's topic is, do your kids and grandkids share your values? And as usual, there's a lot that can be discussed on each topic. But let's make a bracha. Let's start with thanking God Almighty. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Shehakol Niyah B'Dvaro. You know, someone asked me this Shabbat. A good friend asked me. He says, I notice you give the class a cup of coffee. I wonder how many people sit down when they listen to the class, also sit down with a cup of coffee. I said, I have absolutely no idea. I know many of the people who listen to this Torah class, and I get, Baruch Hashem, feedback, and very much appreciated. And it's really a blessing. I really love the people that I interact with, deeply care about them, and it's very, very special when I get feedback. And I would love to hear a thumbs up whether you sit down for this class and you actually sit down with a cup of coffee and you relax so that you could absorb the most sort of penetrating and beautiful words of Torah. So if you do sit down for this class with a cup of coffee, give us a thumbs up. I'd like to just know interesting sort of feedback. Okay. Let's get serious over here with some real Torah study. So today's class is, as we have been doing, mostly connecting it to the Parsha of the week. This past week's Torah portion was Parshat Yitro, where we read about the Ten Commandments, and we read about Moses, and we read about his father-in-law Yitro. And the title of the class, as already mentioned, is, do your kids or your grandkids share your values? Now, as I started to say, that is a class that can be discussed from various dimensions, various angles. We're going to adopt one dimension over here related to the Parsha. Maybe we'll broaden it a little bit as we go along, and we'll have that discussion of how, as we usually try to bring the Torah's Parsha and Torah's ideas into practical today application. So, there's a famous, that those who say that we are who we are, our past basically tells us what our future will be. Or as Napoleon once said, a nation that does not have a past does not have a future. Or in maybe more psychological terms, Sigmund Freud said that the past of a person is his true future, is his sort of definite future, meaning that who you are and who you have been is who you are. You can't do much to change who you are, and that's what it is. That's what it is, and accept that and live with that. So today we will have a discussion of a very interesting personality, biblical personality, that is not much known. I would say probably most that are listening to this class don't know much about this personality. And here we will see a debate, a discussion, whether the past of a person is what will be their future. And past could also mean their sort of lineage, parents, grandparents, and whether you could break with the past positively, negatively, or does it just go along? Eventually, you just get back to what your past is, or not. So let's have that discussion, and that will relate to the discussion of, do your kids share your values? So let me first tell you about this personality that we don't know much about. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, Moses, the greatest of all human beings, communicated directly with God, brought us the Torah, brought all of mankind a code of life given directly from Hashem. And ironically, there's not much that we're told about Moses's family, Moshe's family. Interestingly enough, his brother Aharon, we find a lot more about his family. We find his children took over the high priesthood, his grandchild as well. With regards to Aaron, with regards to Moses, there we find very little. And you would think Moses, the greatest of all people, would he not pass on his leadership and his position to his child or children? But we do not find that happening. Who takes over from Moses? His student Joshua, not his child. And we find very little discussion about who his child was. And today we're going to talk about Moses's grandchild. And Moses' grandchild is a very interesting and somewhat sad story, what happened with Moses, the holiest of all men, his very own grandchild, something that at face value, or even more than just face value, seems very, very surprising, disturbing, etc. So let's explore that. L'chaim. Moshe Rabbeinu had a son called Gershom. He had two sons, Eliezer and Gershom. Gershom, the Torah relates that, why did he give him the name Gershom? Ki geir hayisi be'eretz nachria. Moshe says, I was a stranger in an estranged land. I was in the diaspora. I was in exile, referring to his time in Midian. Gershom had a son. His son his name was Yehonatan, just like we find later in Tanakh. King Saul had a son called Yehonatan, but here we have an earlier personality with his name was Yehonatan. Okay? Which is, in English today, is referred to as Jonathan, but I will choose to call him by his biblical name, Yehonatan. Who was this Yehonatan, grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu? And we know that he was grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu to a certain extent because of how the sages give us sort of the inside story, the behind-the-scenes story of who this Yehonatan was. Yehonatan was a fellow by the name Yehonatan. In the Tanakh, we find him in the scriptures or in the prophets. We find him several times. We find a fellow who is described at some point as Yehonatan ben Menashe. Yehonatan, the son of Menashe. And another place we find him by the name of Shavuel ben Gershom, the Gershom that we're talking about. Now, when it says in the Torah that this Yehonatan was the son of Menashe, the word Menashe, if you remember your Hebrew, you'll understand this. If not, you'll please trust me. The word Menashe is written with a mem. Let me see if I can write this out for a second, okay? Is written with a mem, a nun, shin, and hey. Okay, you see this? See it? I hope it's clear. Menashe. I don't know if it shows up backwards when I show it on the screen. Menashe. However, the nun in Menashe is like hanging. The way it's written in the scriptures by tradition is the nun is sort of written, the letter is written differently than the other three letters, mem, shin, and hey. Now, sages tell us that the reason for that is because this is supposed to be actually read Moshe. Because if you take the nun out of the word Menashe, it reads Moshe. Okay? I hope you haven't lost me over here. So you have Menashe, but Menashe, if you delete the nun, it becomes Moshe. What is the significance in this? So here is the story. The story is the following. There was a fellow by the name of Micha, or Micah. Micha is a very, very sad story, and perhaps it's a little risky for me to mention the story because there are some serious questions about the story of Micha. But since I'm dealing here with an intelligent audience, so I will, and a responsible audience, I will share. Sorry for a second, something fell down here. I will share the story of Micha. Micha was one of the children that Moshe Rabbeinu pleaded with God. There were children that during the Exodus were killed by Pharaoh, and Moshe objected very strongly to God. And God said, okay, I will take one of these children that is at the verge of dying, and I will save him. And you'll see that my judgment is just. And who was this child that Moshe Rabbeinu received because of his prayer from God? This child's name was Micha. This Micha, the Medrash tells us, turned out to be a big thorn by the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, in the sense that he was he was the big instigator, etc., when it came to the golden calf. He became an idol worshiper. He had a certain special idol called the Pesel Micha, which is a story unto its own. The Pesel means the engraved sort of image of Micha. And it was through this Pesel that he was able to bring the golden calf to life, the sin of the golden calf. And later on, after the Jews came to Israel, he set up a separate sort of a house of worship, but a house of worship of idols. And in that house of worship, he had what was this Pesel Micha, this idol that had these sort of magical evil powers. He set up this house of worship, and it came to be known as Beis Micha, the house of Micha, which was a house of idol worship. What does that have to do with our discussion over here? This Micha was looking to hire a high priest for his house of worship. Who does he hire to be his high priest? He hires none other than our Yehonatan that we're talking about, Moshe's grandson, the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu, Yehonatan, and he hires him to become the high priest in charge of this house of idol worship. And of course, the question begs to be answered is, how is it possible that Yonatan, the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu, would accept this job? How is that even how's that possible? So when Yehonatan was asked that question, he gave the answer. He gave this very, very disturbing answer. The disturbing answer was, he said like this. He said, Kach mikublani. I'm reading the Hebrew over here. He said like this. Kach. I'm trying to find the quote over here. Stay with me over here. I'm still here. He says like this. Kach. I'm seeing this from memory because I cannot find it. He says like this. Kach mikublani mi beis Abba. This is what I have passed down from the house of my father and grandfather, meaning passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses. I have this tradition or this directive passed down. And listen to this. Listen to this. Listen to this a statement that he received from his holy grandfather. He said like this. It is better mutter la'odam limkoyres atzmai la'avodah zora. It is better mutov. It is better for a person to sell himself to avodah zara, to idol worship. That's the literal translation. Va'al yitztarech labriut, and he should not become dependent on other human beings. Meaning that Yonasan was saying basically this was my job. I'm not doing this because I believe in it. I don't believe in this idol worship. I don't believe in it. I needed a job. They offered the right pay. And my grandfather taught our family. We have a family teaching, it's tradition in our family. It is best to sell yourself to a house of idol worship and not become dependent on others. Perhaps in today's terms it would be, and not rely on Social Security and not rely on welfare. It is best to go ahead and do whatever you can to get a job and do not rely on being sustained by others. So, this is what was Yonatan's explanation for why he felt justified to do what he did. Now, it is amazingly difficult to understand and attribute this type of saying to Moses, that for a job you should go ahead and sell yourself to a house of idol worship. So what does this mean? Very difficult to understand. So we will explain, okay, because it's a very difficult statement. Now, we find that this Yonatan was blessed with long life. Now, why was he blessed with long life? It seems like he was an idol worshiper. So our sages tell us that Yonatan was not a real idol worshiper, as we just said, that he said this is a job. And not only that, that he went ahead and he used his position. Actually, I want to even go back a statement. He went ahead. Okay, we'll stay here because of a limitation of time. Even though, as I always say, Sunday morning is relaxed time and learn, but still we work within a certain limitation of time. That Yonatan, even though he was the priest of idol worship, and later on he was actually promoted to a higher position where the tribe of Dan offered him a better job, and he took the job. He did not believe in idol worship, of course, and not only did he not believe, he went ahead and he would use his position whenever he can to convince people how nonsensical and how false and how fake the idol worship is. And whoever he could convince to turn away from idol worship, he would do so. So, because, and this in itself is a lesson, as we will soon sum it up and give you the different lessons that we learn from here, and conclude with an interesting story. So this is the reason why it's Moshe or Menashe. Moshe versus Menashe is because, as we know in the Tanakh, Menashe was a great idol worshiper. And the reason why in the Tanakh it refers to his name as the son of Menashe, but the nun is sort of hanging, is because it teaches us that although biologically he was the grandson of Moshe, practically, to a real extent, he was the grandson of Menashe. Meaning that even though Menashe was not his biological grandson, but by being so attached to idol worship for a job, we refer to him as the child of Menashe. Son of Menashe, meaning in terms of his belief, in terms of what he did. So that's why we have the Menashe, Moshe, the two names over here. However, so here we see Yonatan, the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu, involved in a very terrible way because of how he interpreted the statement of his grandfather. We find that he wasn't connected to idol worship. Not only was he connected, he was the priest, he was the high priest. But because he used his position to also convince people away from the idol worship, because he persuaded them not to, when he felt he had a sort of an in and a soft spot, he merited to live a long life. And we find him again later on with King David HaMelech. David HaMelech went ahead and King David, it says, hired a fellow by the name of Shavuel ben Gershom. Shavuel, the son of Gershom. Our sages tell us that who was this Shavuel? The Shavuel is none other than our Jonathan that we're talking about over here. And Shavuel, the name Shavuel means returned or returnee. Kael is God's name. Shavuel, but we don't say God's name, so I'm saying Shavuel. So in other words, returnee to God, or God returned him, or he returned to God. What's the story behind that? In his later years, King David approached him and said, Jonathan, you are the grandson of Moshe. What are you involved in idol worship? And he told David the explanation we gave. My grandfather said to me, to the family, passed down, that you should sell yourself to idol worship and do not become dependent on other human beings. Work, do something to make a living, whatever it takes. So King David said to him, you are totally mistaken in your interpretation of your grandfather's words. You think that your grandfather for a moment would advise you to be involved in idol worship, which is the cardinal of all sins, the worst of all sins? You misunderstood him. When he says the word avodah zarah, which is commonly interpreted as idol worship, in Hebrew, avodah zarah more literally means a work that is estranged from you. Zar means it's strange for you. And what he meant is that even no matter what your level of prestige is, you should be willing to do a work that's sort of menial to you or embarrassing to you. Like the Talmud uses the expression, you should go ahead and collect garbage in today's terms. If that's what it takes to make a living for your family, to put bread on the table, there is no shame in whatever job you have to do in order to put bread on your table. And that's what your grandfather meant. Avodah zarah means a work which is alien to you. You don't like it, you don't enjoy it, it doesn't befit you, it's not. You might be an intellectual, you would like to have a job of teaching, you'd like to have a job as a professor, you'd like to have a job of science and so on, but you can't find it. The only job available is for you to go ahead and paint buildings. The only job available for you is to go ahead and work for the sanitation department. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. Do whatever job, even if it's avodah zarah, it's alien to you. Don't become dependent on other human beings. I had one of my children, without saying names, of course, one of my children at one point was living in New York, and he says to me, he says, Ta, I'd like to apply to get Social Security, so I have extra, just some extra allowance and extra money and so on, so that I could spend on whatever. And I said to him, absolutely not. Taking that money is not taking it from nobody. It's the people's money. It's individuals' money. It's not like an entity that belongs to nobody. Thank God you have parents that support you, give you what you need. You want to have just money so you could buy mishigas, as we say in Yiddish or Hebrew. No. A person should, Shlomo HaMelech says, Soneh matanot yichyeh, one who despises gifts will live. So, that is what King David explained to Yehonatan. And Yonatan went ahead and he accepted that explanation. And he did shuvah, he repented, he left the house of idol worship. And not only that, King David gave him a job, he hired him, because he understood that money was an issue. He gave him a job to be the treasurer, to be his treasurer, and if I remember correctly, specifically, namely, to build actually the Bet HaMikdash, the house, the holy temple, which King David was prepared it to be built for King Solomon, his son, who actually eventually erected the Holy Temple. So this is the story. This is the story. And now let's apply this story. Let's apply this story and the various lessons we can learn from this story. Various very important lessons in the story. We asked the question about how strong our past affects our future. And if we've been stuck in a certain path, or we're going along in a certain path, is there any even point in trying to change that? So from this story, you see in both directions, and I think they're both important points. On the one hand, you see that even though Jonathan came from such an illustrious background, he came from Gershon, the son of Moshe Rabbeinu. So his background, his avar, his past, were definitely the highest you could ask for. But nevertheless, you cannot take that for granted. Because here Yehonatan, because of what were his life's challenges, the pressure of monetary pressure, so here Yehonatan went ahead and he succumbed to those pressures. On the other hand, you could make the argument just the opposite, which is that ultimately he did repent. So even though for years and years he was sort of stuck in a certain past of being connected to idol worship, he was eventually able to break out of that. And I want to elaborate on that point because with an observation that I've just thought about, more recently. We asked the question, do your kids share your values? Do your grandkids share your values? So over here is where education and sort of inculcating our kids with those values play a major role. Now, you could say, well, Rabbi, that's obvious. Or you could say, look, I have taught my kids certain values, Jewish values, Menschlichkeit values, and unfortunately they've deviated from those values and I don't see the results of my effort, so what's the point? So, well, while that could be answered again with various answers, I want to take one point, highlight one point over here, which is what I have noticed that often the strong education that we give our children, again, let me open the shade here, it's a little dark. The strong education and principles that we share with our kinderach can have two types of effects. One effect, which is the most desired effect, is that they fully lock in step, sort of they fully follow in our footprints, in our footsteps, and they continue that which we believe, that which we've taught them, etc. That is sort of level number one, and that's fantastic and beautiful. Sometimes our children will decide to take their own journey. And that could be either because we haven't spent the proper time to show them and teach them and guide them, or I would say also, just like Yonatan, while he was the priest, he was only outwardly so, but inwardly he did not believe, which is why he was able to affect people to leave the idol worship. When your children sense that it's not real, it's not genuine, it's not what you really believe in, your excitement level of sports perhaps is not the same. They don't feel your soul, they don't feel your warmth, your kishkes in when you teach them Torah, when you teach them the values of your family, the principles and so on. I mean, I want to, just share something that I believe my kids know, and I'm sharing this with you. It's somewhat private or personal, for the benefit of maybe in some way implementing that in your life, in your home, in terms of affecting your kinderlach, your children. So the most favorite time of the week for me is, and maybe I shouldn't give away the secret, the most favorite time in the week for me is Shabbat morning at probably 5:30, 6 a.m. till about 7:30 a.m. For this hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on the week, on Saturday morning, Shabbat morning, it is the most favorite time of my week. Why so? Because that's the time of the week. First of all, Shabbat, phones are off. Thank God phones are off. Because I am, my kids make fun of me, I am a technology person. I use my phone and my technology and social media overwhelmingly for spreading sort of Torah, mitzvot, connecting with people who are in need. I mean, last week, without saying names, all of a sudden I get a call. Rabbi, my aunt, she's 105 years old. She was just taken to the hospital. Could you please pray for her? So I definitely use the phone for holiness, for goodness, etc., etc. But nevertheless, it's like there's a constant, distraction. Shabbat, thank God, phone is off. Phone is totally off. Wonderful. But Shabbat for a rabbi, as many of you know, is not a day off. There's interaction, things that need to get done, community, etc., which is all fine and wonderful. The only time in the week where I could sit down and open up my Torah books, my Chumash with commentaries, different Torah books, and be able to learn without distraction is that hour and a half or 2 hours of the week. And I cherish it, and I love it more than anything else. And my kids know that. I share that with them. It's the most special time in the week for me. I remember hearing from Reb Label Shapiro, great rabbi in Miami. He's like the rabbi's rabbi. We call him when we have questions in Jewish law, more complicated questions. And I remember hearing from him that when he had his first child, there was a Chassid, there was a Hasidic Jew by the name, a very prominent Chassid in the early years of this generation of Chabad in the 1950s. His name was Reb Shmuel Levitin, very prominent, wise, scholarly Hasidic Jew. And Reb Leib related that when he had his first child, Reb Shmuel Levitin came over to him. He was sitting in 770 in the yeshiva over there, and Reb Leib, I think it was in 770, Reb Shmuel says to him in Yiddish, "Erst jetzt darf man sein mit an Emerson frum." Now you have to truly be religious, truly be observant. Meaning, although you might have been observant all your life, which he was, he grew up in a religious, observant home. Now that you have a child, it has to be real. Because your children will detect if it's genuine or not. If it's not genuine, they will feel. If it's not what you truly love, they will sense it. Getting back to our discussion. We spoke about level 1, where your kid just walks in your footsteps, all fine and good, dandy, no challenges, no problems, and so on. However, often, especially in today's world where there's so much exposure, children will take their own journey, and sometimes they will take a journey which you're definitely uncomfortable with in terms of their religious experience and the connection and adoption sort of in their own life of your principles and values. And I have observed that more often than not, a child that you have invested and spent your soul, your kishkes, in educating in a loving and proper manner where discipline is necessary, their fallback position when they have their own challenges of life is very often they'll come back to that core values and principles that you have inculcated, or that you have invested in them, and so on. And perhaps that's also the lesson that we learn here from Yehonatan. Although for so many years he was involved in something that cannot be more distant than his grandfather Moshe Rabbeinu, because of a mistaken interpretation, at the end he came back to his roots. He came back to the teachings of Moshe Rabbeinu. And interestingly enough, King David was wise enough to find a way to do so by sensing what are his weaknesses. Okay, he has a weakness that he loves money. He has a weakness or that he has money anxiety, whichever way you want to frame that. He said, you know what, let me give him a job. And by that, I'll make it easier for him to live the life of his true values and his principles, which in itself is also a lesson in how we approach a fellow individual who is struggling with maintaining their own principles and values. I want to end up with a story. It's kind of a cute story. We spoke about the name Menashe, Moshe, the two names. So I want to end up with a story. I shared this yesterday in the synagogue at the services. And it's a cute and meaningful story. The story is told about a rabbi, who gets a message at 3 o'clock in the morning. He gets a message, or let's modernize it. He gets a phone call, 3 o'clock in the morning, his phone rings. And on the phone is one of his congregants by the name of Yankel. And Yankel says to the rabbi, Rabbi, I need you to come over right now to my home. And the rabbi says, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You cannot wait until the morning. He says, no, Rabbi, my wife and I are having this major fight. We need you to come try to resolve the issue. So the rabbi, Shalom Bayit, peace between husband and wife is highly important, of course. It's highly important between husband and wife. It's highly important in God's eyes. The Talmud at the end of Tractate Gittin says that any man and woman that can become divorced, the Mizbeach, the altar, sheds tears for them. So the rabbi gets out of bed, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, he goes over to his congregant's home, and of course he meets husband and wife, and he's eager to see what's this emergency that can't wait till the morning. And they say to the rabbi the following. They say, Rabbi, tomorrow morning we're doing a bris. Mazel tov, wonderful, beautiful. What's the problem? He says, I'll tell you what the problem is. He says, I want to name the child after my father. I want to name the child after my father. Okay, fine. But my wife insists, and she wants to name the child after her father. No, this is not such an uncommon argument. He says, but what's the big deal? I mean, you had to wake me up. He says, yeah, we have to resolve this. The bris is early in the morning, and we need to have this resolved. So the rabbi asks his, he's thinking maybe he could combine the names. Sometimes compromises can be worked out. He asks Yankel, then what was your father's name? My father's name was Yosef. My father's name was Yosef. What a wonderful name, beautiful name. Turns to the wife, what's your objection? He says, well, I want the child to be named after my dad. He says, what was your dad's name? He says, my dad's name was Yosef. The rabbi says, perfect. What's the fight? Your father-in-law's name was Yosef. Your father's name is Yosef. I suggest we call the child Yosef. She says, no, you don't understand. You don't understand, Rabbi. He says, it's not as simple. We wouldn't wake you up for that. He says, look, my dad, the Mrs. Yankel says, we'll call her Leah. Leah says to the rabbi, my dad was a righteous man. He was a pious man. He was a kind man. Everybody in town loved him. He was the first to step up and do a favor. That's who my dad was. Unfortunately, my father-in-law was just the opposite. He was conniving. He was a thief. He was a lowlife. He was. Everybody knew that you stay away from this guy. And therefore, I want the child to be named after my father, Yosef, the righteous guy, not Yosef, the crook. He turns to the husband, and the husband says, my wife happens to be right. My dad was not a role model. My dad was definitely had many fell short in many areas, but he's still my father. He's still my dad. I want my child to be named after my dad. Was tut man? So what's the solution over here? The rabbi says, let me think about it. Give me a couple of moments. He steps out of the room, and he comes back, and he says, I have a solution. I have a solution. He says, this is what I suggest that we name the child. We named the child. Let's see if you could guess. We named the child Yosef. They both start screaming, Yosef who? My father, you're my father. What's it? The rabbi says, I'll tell you. We're going to name the child Yosef. The way you're going to raise this child and what you're going to invest in this child will determine whether he'll be Yosef the crook or Yosef the pious one. If you invest and he becomes a righteous, pious individual, then we know he was named after your dad. If he grows up, because you're not going to put in what you need to put in to him, you're not going to educate him, you're not going to give him the right schooling, you're not going to make sure he's around the right friends, you're not going to act as a true role model, and he's going to turn out to be a lowlife, then we know who he was named after in that case. So this is the Moshe and Menashe situation. Yehonatan had the choice to be Menashe-like or Moshe-like. For many years, unfortunately, he turned out, regardless of his past, and therefore we can never take the past for granted, he turned out to be Menashe's child. Fortunately, David HaMelech, and I will add that perhaps it was his holy past that ultimately came to the forefront, because sometimes children take their own journey. That does happen. But what we invest in them, more often than not, will eventually resurface, and they will become the wonderful grandchildren that Moshe Rabbeinu, the teacher of all of Jews, can be proud of. So that's today's lesson. Thank you so much for listening. We do encourage you, of course, to share these words of Torah with others so that they could implement within their lives these beautiful messages of Torah. Have a wonderful, amazing, fantastic week.